Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Brennan with the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Thanks so much for joining us for another edition of Behind the Headlines, the online learning series that allows you to learn directly from and engage with Notre Dame experts on topics in the news. If you watched the State of the Union address last night, you saw President Obama call on Congress to pass a resolution authorizing military force against ISIS. Today we'll be discussing the topic of the threat posed by ISIS as well as Al-Qaeda and looking at how the United States is and should be responding to that threat. And we're very lucky today to be guiding us through this important and complicated topic to have with us Professor Michael Desch. Professor Desch is the chair of the Political Science Department here at the University of Notre Dame, and he's the co-director of the Notre Dame International Security Program. Professor Desch, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure.
For those of you joining us live, if you haven't been with us for one of our online learning events before, just to let you know how this is going to work, Professor Desch is going to first walk us through his presentation, and afterwards we'll be taking your questions. So you can submit questions starting now and throughout the event by entering your questions in the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen there, and as time allows, we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. So with that, Professor Desch, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Kevin, and a warm Irish greeting to Domer Nation out there in Cyberland. Title of my talk is Terror on the March. What should we do now about ISIS and Al-Qaeda? And the resurgent terror threat is really ripped right from the headlines. There's no doubt that terrorism is on everybody's radar screen in a big way. Despite the death of Osama bin Laden a couple of years ago, the Al-Qaeda Central franchise, well, Al-Qaeda Central may be a little bit weakened, but the franchise for Al-Qaeda seems to be doing pretty well. They're not McDonald's, but there are a lot of affiliate groups of Al-Qaeda, including Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is probably the most effective and important Al-Qaeda franchise. And in fact, Yemen is in the news because the place is just in absolute turmoil. The Al-Shabaab in Somalia is also rallied to the Al-Qaeda banner, and they're raising a lot of hell, not only in Somalia, but also in other parts of Eastern Africa. And of course, you have Boko Haram in Nigeria and Al-Qaeda affiliates in Libya and Mali as well. So the AQ franchise seems to be continuing unabated. But there's a new kid on the block, and the new kid on the block is ISIS, ISIL, or as they say in Arabic, Desch. No relation to your humble speaker. The president sort of put his foot in it about a year ago by referring to ISIL as the B team. I don't think they're 10 feet tall, but as we've seen in both Syria and Iraq, they're hardly the B team. This group has proven itself pretty adept at playing a grotesque version of political theater and gotten a lot of headlines from the horrible things that they've done to some Westerners that have had the misfortune to fall in under their control. And then last week, we had some French citizens of North African extraction who went on a rampage in Paris, which sort of telegraphs the danger that many fear terrorism, and especially Salafist Islamicist terrorism, poses to the developed world. People are calling the terror attacks in Paris the French 9/11, and I think that's probably not a inaccurate characterization. Not so much comparable in terms of loss of life, but certainly comparable in terms of the effect on the national psyche, not only in France, but also in many other parts of especially Western Europe. So the question we want to talk about today is how should we think about the terrorist threat given all these developments? And I like to start out with the CW. What do you think the CW stands for, Kevin?
Conventional wisdom.
The conventional wisdom, yes. The conventional wisdom, if you read the newspaper, if you watch cable TV, is that the terrorist threat seems to be growing. There's certainly, I think, part of the zeitgeist is that terrorism is right up there on the threat list. And given that, the consensus in our political system is that we need to combat it aggressively. That the best defense is a good offense. Here at Notre Dame, we know that. Or other people will say we need to kill them, referring to the terrorists over there, so they don't kill us over here. All of this is basically, an argument on behalf of a very forward-leaning U.S. posture in dealing with the terrorist threat. I have a somewhat contrarian view. You wouldn't have me on this show if I just parroted the conventional wisdom, but I actually believe this contrarian view. I think that the image that terrorism is on the rise, well, it's widely held and it's understandable given recent events, neglects the fact that it's a relatively constant feature of life, even before 9/11. Indeed, I use the metaphor of a chronic disease, maybe diabetes, maybe a form of cancer that's serious but won't kill you, that's chronic. You need to attend to it regularly, but it's also not going to do you in. And I also think that sometimes you need to take the fight to people that are waging a terrorist campaign against us and our allies. And so I buy into part of the conventional wisdom, but other times I think you should act with restraint. I think that's actually sometimes the better strategy for winning the war against terror. And that's what I want to try to lay out in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. Actually, I want to try to do three things. One is I want to define terrorism, because I think it's important to understand what we're talking about here. Secondly, I want to put the terrorist threat in context, the context of other threats, other things that might kill us. And then finally, I want to suggest what I think is a smarter strategy for dealing with the real terrorist threat. So what is terrorism? How should we think about it? I think about terrorism as the use of violence or military force against civilians, okay, to achieve a particular political objective. It's related, in my view, to guerrilla warfare and insurgency. And I'll tell you why I think that's the case. But it's important to understand that the terrorism is a strategic approach. In fact, I think sometimes we tend to lose sight of that because we focus very heavily on the moral aspects of terrorism, and particularly for those of us steeped in the Catholic just war tradition, the deliberate targeting of civilians we regard, rightly so in my view, as anathema. Killing civilians is evil, no doubt about it. But we also need to understand that there is a strategic logic that animates terrorist groups that employ this particular approach to warfare. Indeed, it's, and I'm going to use a little security studies wonkery jargon here, it's a form of asymmetric warfare. It's a weapon of the weak. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me tell you a little story. It's a famous story that after the Oslo agreements between the Israelis and the Palestinians in the early 1990s, when the Israeli and Palestinian security services started talking to each other and actually cooperating, that over dinner or something, maybe after dinner, a senior Israeli general sat down with a senior Fatah, PLO, former guerrilla, who is now head of the Palestinian Security Service. And, you know, they were sort of reliving old days. And the Israeli general said, you know, why did you engage in such a despicable campaign of terrorism against Israel? Why didn't you fight this war some way else? You know, it was clearly didn't work, and it was counterproductive in terms of public relations. And the Palestinian former guerrilla smiled and he said, you know, that wasn't our first choice. And in fact, had you offered us a battalion of your fine Merkava tanks, we'd have been happy to fight you in a conventional way, but this terrorism was the only option that we had. So terrorism is the weapon of the week. There's a strategic logic for it that shouldn't be obscured by our legitimate moral objections to it. Okay, second thing I want to lay out is an argument about context. I'm not saying terrorism isn't a serious threat and that our leaders should not do anything about it. It's serious, but it's also not catastrophic. And here again, I think the popular discourse tends to portray this threat in greater terms than it really is. And indeed, you see these videos of ISIS convoys in Toyota trucks. Kevin, you know where those Toyota trucks, by the way, came from that I had in the picture before?
I do not know.
Those Toyota trucks that were rolling south, excuse me, in Iraq from Mosul towards Baghdad this summer were non-lethal aid that we had provided to the quote-unquote moderate resistance in Syria. But in any case, you know, they've been converted into gun trucks, and ISIS, ISIL, Desch has them. And, you know, it's pretty scary because they were really on a roll last summer. And, of course, the events in Paris, you know, contribute also to a sense that, that we're under siege. And it's understandable if people think that terrorism is the greatest threat that we face. And it is a threat, but let's put it in context. Terrorism, in fact, doesn't even make the top 25 threats to us, of things that'll kill us. Now, this figure is not very good, and it's even worse, you know, the way it's presented up there. But basically, the big square and then the smaller squares in descending order are the sort of things that kill Americans on a daily basis. Of course, lots more of us die in auto accidents, die of cancer from smoking, die of other diseases. Indeed, we have a higher probability of dying from complications of appendicitis than we do of dying in a terrorist attack. And this is factoring in one of the most dramatic terrorist attacks in American history, the attack on September 11th, 2001. So it's useful to, you know, to think about this as a, in the context where it really ought to be placed. Okay, so given that, let's get to the money issue that I think, do we call them our listeners, our lurkers? What do you call people?
Sure, viewers, yeah.
Viewers. How should we deal with terrorism? Now, I want to say, I'm not a pacifist. I don't object to using military force as part of a war against terrorist organizations. Indeed, I tell people I spent 4 years in Texas, and in Texas there's a category of justifiable homicide that somebody just needed killing. And I, in all seriousness, I think that there are some members of terrorist organizations you can't negotiate with, you can't isolate. And if they get visited by a Hellfire missile from a drone or from a representative of our Special Operations Command, I will be happy about that. But I do think that we have not been smart in recent years, and I say recent going all the way back at least till the fall, late fall of 2001, in how we've balanced military force and other instruments of statecraft in this global war on terrorism. And again, I think this is a war, and I think we've got to fight it, but I think we could fight it in a different way than we have in the past. So let me lay out some what I think are principles of smart counterterrorism, just to get them out on the table so we can talk about it with the viewers. First of all, terrorism's evil. No, you'll get no defense of that from me. But again, let's put it in context. War is evil. And far more civilians are killed in conventional operations than are by terrorist attacks. And all you need to do is go back and look, for example, at the numbers of civilians that we killed in Nazi Germany or in Japan during the air campaign during those countries during World War II. And that's no exception. Civilians increasingly are the main victims of major wars, including the war in Iraq and Afghanistan most recently. And they're killed largely as a result of intended or unintended consequences of conventional military operations. Secondly, terrorism, like insurgency, is both a military and a political strategy. Okay? It's not just a way of fighting a war, it's part of a larger campaign. When ISIS is filming these spiffy videos and spending lots of money on a website and things like that, this is an integral part of how they see themselves furthering their objective. So this is how the enemy is fighting the war. We have to fight it in the same way with both a military and a political strategy. So third thing I think we want to keep in mind is part of the strategy of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda is to provoke the West, and especially the United States, to overreact. Okay, now why would they want to do that? Well, one is, like insurgency, terrorism is about coercing and attracting the large bulk of the population that isn't committed one way or another. And one of the best ways to do that is to get large numbers of foreign troops involved in combat operations in somebody else's country. And in fact, what was interesting about, as the details of these three fellows in Paris who were involved in these terrible terrorist attacks last week became clear, our operations in Iraq in particular had done an awful lot to contribute to their radicalization. And that certainly was the case within Iraq as well. And secondly, most of these terrorist organizations understand that they're not going to be able to recreate September 11th, come over here and kill Americans. They've tried and they failed. They got lucky on September 11th. That's probably not going to happen again. So if you want to kill young American boys and girls, you've got to get Uncle Sam to send them over to a place that puts them within range of a ISIL AK-47. So again, we want to think about this. We may want to use military force against particular targets, but the idea that you would make a large military commitment with a lot of American boots on the ground, got to think about that very hard, because that's exactly what Al-Qaeda wanted, especially in Iraq, and certainly what ISIL would love for us to be doing today in Iraq. Finally, we have allies in this fight. Now, allies are always a double-edged sword. Anytime you have to depend on other people, it could be problematic. But on the other, and especially when our allies are weak in ineffective governments or military organizations in these countries, a lot of times the instinct for Americans is to, okay, well, we'll take care of this ourselves. But think back to the famous advice from Colonel T.E. Lawrence, who was the British military expert on Arab irregular war during the First World War in Mesopotamia. And he famously advised the British General Staff in Cairo to let the Arabs do things for themselves badly rather than not at all. And that's advice that we would be well advised to take today. And indeed, my view, if you want to put a bumper sticker on my talk today, is less is more, at least as an approach to counterterrorism. Oh my goodness, well, we got all of that at the same time. But let me just, try to justify this particular argument. Now, it's understandable after 9/11 or after, an attack like the British saw in London or the Spaniards saw in Madrid or the French saw in Paris just this last week, to strike back hard and in a big way. But just remember, this is exactly what these terrorist campaigns are designed to do. They're happy to get whacked and to lose militarily to reap the political gains of having Western countries involved in a big way in various places in the Middle East. Now, sometimes we're going to have to use military force. There's just no way around it. But if we do it, we want to do it from over the horizon, and we want to do it in a discriminate way. What we want to do is maintain the smallest possible footprint or boot print when we conduct military operations against terrorists in other people's countries as we possibly can. So I think the weapon of choice for this is drones and special operations. They're not a panacea, but in terms of all the ways we can use military force, and by the way, use military force in a way that minimizes collateral damage of innocent civilians, drones and special operations are far better than large large conventional operations. Third thing is the diplomatic piece. Terrorism is a political military strategy. Our response needs to be political and military. We have no problem with the military piece of it, but I think we need more of the diplomatic piece. And we should be thinking about this in the same way that we think, for example, about economic development and political reform in waging counterinsurgency. If you read General Petraeus's famous counterinsurgency manual, 90% of this military manual is about political reform, economic development, civic action. Same thing with terrorism. And here, let's conduct a little thought experiment. What would our situation be in terms of public opinion in the Arab and especially the Islamic world if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were resolved? And I don't want to be Pollyannish and say that 100% or 90% of our troubles in the Middle East are a function of this, but on the other hand, I think 30 to 40% of our problems are the result of the fact that we're identified as being overwhelmingly supportive of one side of this historical conflict. And if we got that off the table, I think it would be a big advance in terms of winning the hearts and minds of the uncommitted center. Allies. I said allies are important. They're going to bungle things. Our ally in Iraq until recently was Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, a representative of the Shia majority in Iraq. Maliki probably played an even bigger role in the current mess in Iraq than ISIS did. Had Maliki pursued an inclusive and non-sectarian policy in Iraq, ISIL wouldn't have stood an ice cube's chance in hell in achieving the gains that it has in Iraq, which are almost invariably in the Sunni majority areas of the country, particularly in Al-Anbar province. And in fact, the lesson of the Iraq War was that initially our invasion of Iraq in March of 2003 alienated the minority Sunnis, and they hopped in bed with Al-Qaeda, which, by the way, had never existed in Iraq prior to our overthrow of Saddam Hussein. But sometime late 2004, early 2005, as a result both of Al-Qaeda making itself odious to the Sunnis, who were not at all on board with the Al-Qaeda program, and a series of strategic outreaches by the United States military to various Sunni tribal forces, all of a sudden things started to turn around. And in fact, the period even before the so-called surge of American troops, Al-Qaeda was really on the run because the Sunni tribes had flipped. Second thing about allies is strange bedfellows. There's an old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I think there's a lot of strategic wisdom in that. Who is the `1 enemy of ISIL, ISIS, Desch in Iraq? It's Iran. In fact, the United States and the Iranian military have been tacitly collaborating in the war against ISIS, ISIL, Daesh up till this point. But I think we ought to think more broadly about it. I think the Obama administration's efforts to undermine Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and I have no truck with him because he's certainly not a nice guy, but we should have seen that a weakening of his regime would open the door for some bad guys. Conversely, we're upset by the fact that Hezbollah from Lebanon and the Assad regime are cooperating in the fight against ISIL in Syria. I think belatedly the Obama administration is realizing that we're probably better off with Bashar al-Assad than we are with ISIL or the Nusra Front or some of these other really rotten groups that could come to power if Assad goes. So let me offer 3 bottom lines. I'm not seeing my bottom lines here. Okay, I've got them there, I promise you. Let's see. Okay, so the terror threat is serious but not catastrophic. Put it in context. That's all I ask. Second, keep in mind that successful counterterrorism is as much political as it is military. We shouldn't expect to kill our way out of all of our troubles with it. Now, violence and military force is a big part of it, don't get me wrong, but so is diplomacy, and so are alliances and concessions. And then finally, I think we can deal with ISIS as much by what we don't do as what we do. And in fact, doing less is probably ultimately the better solution. So I guess my takeaway is keep calm, don't panic, stiff upper lip. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Desch. For those of you joining us live, just a reminder, we're now going to move into the Q&A portion of this afternoon's program, and you can submit your questions now on the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen, and we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can in the half hour we have left here. You talked a lot about how terrorism is about politics as well as about military issues. We have a question here from Diane, one of our viewers, and she asks, what role does religion play in terrorism, specifically with groups like ISIS, and are their actions fueled more by politics or by religious doctrine?
Well, I'm not somebody that thinks that religion is irrelevant. I mean, I think today the overwhelming source of serious terrorism is coming from religious groups in the Islamic world. And so I think we've got to be serious about that. My qualifications would be that we not tar all Muslims with the behavior of some fringe groups who claim to be acting in the name of their religion. I remember in Boston in the late 80s being in bars when people passed the beret for the IRA, be sort of like blaming all Catholics for what they were up to. But I do think that there is an element of conflict within Islam or debate that needs to be resolved in favor of modernity. And so I'm a big believer in engaging in religious dialogue about Islam and modernity, because I do think that there is an element of Islam that's incompatible with the modern world, and at least some of our terrorist problem is a reaction to modernity.
And we had a related question from another one of our viewers, which was asking, is there something, or is there more that Islamic leaders across the world who are not supportive of these terrorist actions, is there more that they can be doing to persuade Islamic terrorists to kind of modernize and give up these their terrorism, essentially?
I think the leaders and the people in the Islamic and particularly in the Arab world are bearing the brunt of Islamic fundamentalist inspired terrorism. You look at the civil war in Yemen right now, and the people who are being killed in the name of Islam are people who are adherents of a different form of Islam than what the terrorists advocate. So I think that that there's already a lot going on. So the idea that they need to be doing more strikes me as sort of slighting, but the fact that they're bearing much more of the burden than we are, and they're doing a lot. I think the biggest thing, though, would be among Islamic religious and political thinkers that the debate about Islam and modernity needs to be even more robust than it is. Because, I think the old assumption was that Islam, like other religions, was going the way of the dodo bird. And so the period in the Middle East from, the end of the Second World War until, quite recently was dominated by Arab socialism and other forms of secular nationalism. So we sort of thought the religion problem would take care of itself by being irrelevant. Religion has come back in a big way, and by the way, it's very important even in our society. So the issue then, it seems to me, is thinking through how you reconcile living religion with the modern world. And I think that's the biggest challenge.
We have a question from Bud, who asks about the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and that, while terrorism is not, on the list of things most likely to kill Americans, might not be that high, should we be becoming increasingly concerned, and how is it possible to feel comfortable with the idea on the horizon that nuclear weapons could fall into weak hands who'd want to use it, for terrorism purposes?
Yeah, and I'm a little bit contrarian on this as well, on two grounds. First of all, I think the effect of the spread of nuclear weapons since the dawn of the nuclear age in 1945 has been on balance to stabilize international relations. I think you asked me why there wasn't a hot war out of the Cold War, and the fact that both the United States and the Soviet Union had large numbers of nuclear weapons on each side explains about 95% of the variance, in my view. Now, okay, but people will say, maybe the U.S. and the Soviet Union are different than contemporary groups, particularly terrorist groups in the world today. I don't buy that argument. I don't buy the argument on two grounds. First of all, anybody who tells me that the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, which killed probably over the course of its benighted reign at least 30 million people, or the ultimate crazy state of 20th century history, Mao's China, were any less radical or any less radical than Iran, for example, today, I think just are completely missing the boat. Many possible nuclear proliferators, and the Iranians are sort of the key one today, certainly are not regimes we'd like to be associated with. But I don't see their getting nuclear weapons as taking us out of this mutual deterrence framework. Because remember, if Iran gets nuclear capability, it'll be very small compared to the United States and Israel. And despite what people say, Iran is not a crazy state. So the final fallback defense of this argument then is to say, well, what about a nuclear handoff? What if the Iranians, for example, gave Hezbollah in South Lebanon one nuclear weapon to use against Israel? Couldn't that happen? And I do think that a non-state actor that got nuclear capability would be a problem for deterrence, but I don't ever see that happening. The Iranians are developing nuclear weapons because they perceive a threat to themselves. So they're not going to give the crown jewels to another group with whom they're allied, but who they don't control. And by the way, the Israelis have made quite clear to the Iranians that if Hezbollah ever used weapons of mass destruction against Israel, that the return address is not East Beirut, but rather Tehran. So I see this as a non-problem.
A reminder for those of you joining us live, you can submit your questions now for Professor Desch using the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. Another question coming in from the audience here is, why is there such a backlash against the use of drones?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And of course, my colleague, Mary Ellen O'Connell in the law school is one of the leading critics of the use of drones. So, you should probably have her on the show to lay out that case. I think it comes down to a couple of things. I mean, first of all, it sort of offends our sense of fighting fair. A drone armed with a Hellfire missile against a terrorist group in Waziristan or something like that is sort of like the First Armored Division fighting the Apaches in the middle of the 19th century. It's just a completely unfair fight, and I think that a lot of people viscerally object to that. Also, a drone is with a precision-guided munition is a very discriminant weapon, but if you get the wrong target coordinates, if you get bad intelligence, you can kill innocent people. And there have been examples famously of weddings in the tribal region in Western Pakistan that have been targeted in error. So I think people are worried about that. And that happens. I just think, in the context of, are you going to use a drone with a Hellfire missile, or are you going to send a battalion of the 82nd Airborne in to take out a target? Which is going to kill more innocent non-combatants? And it's going to be the boots on the ground. So You can never be perfect, but I think drones are a more humane in terms of avoiding collateral damage of non-combatants than the alternative. Now, I think there is a legitimate critique that critics make, and it's one that I share, and that's the argument that drones are so easy to use that it might sort of exacerbate our belief that we can shoot our way out of a lot of problems. And this is a critique that I share. I mean, you want to be very careful about it, which is why I emphasize that the successful counterterrorism campaign is going to involve a little bit of force and a lot of diplomacy and non-military instruments.
Is there a criticism of drones among some, people maybe on the other side of other critics who would say that by putting more boots in the ground, you could apprehend terrorists and try to get information from them that could be used for larger purposes in the fight against terrorism? That in using drones, if you're sort of killing those people instead of taking some of them capture, is that at all a concern in the calculus about trying to extract information from some of these terrorists rather than killing them through drone strikes?
Well, the argument I've heard is not so much the intelligence argument, but rather the argument that you've got to take the territory and then you've got to hold it. You've got to keep terrorists from moving back in and exploiting a political vacuum. With a drone strike, it's over, and drones are not good at policing territory. And again, I think there's a grain of truth in it, but I think I think about it in terms of the balance of costs and benefits. I think the marginal loss in intelligence and our inability to hold the territory for a long length of time are far outweighed by the advantages of having a minimal boot print on the ground. I don't want American military forces operating for the longer term in Waziristan. I mean, you think Kandahar in South Afghanistan was a crummy place for Americans to be. I can assure you the tribal regions of Pakistan will be even worse.
Michael sent in a question referring to when you discussed how diplomacy comes into play, and sometimes the enemy of your enemy is your friend in a certain sense. And he asked about Iran specifically and said that Iran is one of the primary forces behind Hezbollah and provided support for the Iraqi insurgency, which involved into Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and wants to know how you would propose working with them against ISIS while simultaneously opposing them in other areas where our interests are divergent.
Okay, well, I think Michael misspoke. The Iranians did not support Al-Qaeda in Iran. They supported Shia groups, particularly the Jaish al-Mahdi, that was led by Muqtada al-Sadr. And these groups did fight Americans, so they have American blood on their hand. But the Iranians did not have anything to do with Al-Qaeda. But nonetheless, the larger point that he's pushing me to address, I think, is in a sense a fair one. Iran is a big supporter of Hezbollah. Iran has supported terrorism against the United States in the past. On the other hand, there are lots of countries we've gone to war with in the past that we now cooperate with very closely. Remember King George III and the British? Now we've got the special relationship. Second thing I'd point out is it's not just the Iranians that have waged war using terrorism. I stayed in the King David Hotel this summer in Jerusalem. King David Hotel was the British military and civilian headquarters during the Mandate period. And a Jewish group, the Irgun, which was led by a man, Menachem Begin, who would later become Prime Minister of Israel and a very close ally of the United States, blew that up, killing not only British soldiers, but also British civilians. So one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So it's not, in my view, clear that the Iranians are any guiltier than other people have been in using this form of warfare. And in any case, I go back to the old adage, they want to kill ISIS, ISIL, Desch. I'm happy to have their help with it. That doesn't mean that we'll necessarily be good buddies down the road, but that's life in the dog-eat-dog world of international politics. We've been happy, during World War II, we made common cause with Uncle Joe Stalin, one of the 20th century's great mass murderers, to defeat Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. And that's same logic, it seems to me, would push us in the direction of doing what we're already doing, which is tacitly cooperating with the Iranians in this area where we clearly have parallel interests.
Another question coming in here wants to get your opinion on the situation with the $200 million ransom being asked for the 2 Japanese hostages being held. And, the questioner says that to him it seems like a no-brainer that they shouldn't be paying a ransom, but that reading the news, it seems like there's being consideration given to it. And he wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that situation.
Yeah, I think that's a terrible dilemma for a country to be in. And of course, the United States has been in it 3 times recently, including a young fellow from our own state of Indiana. But I guess I'm with the questioner. I think if you start paying off hostage takers, you make it a paying enterprise. And I hope that the Japanese, stand firm on this, because it's a bad precedent to set. It's a bad precedent because if the Japanese do it, and many European governments have already done it, lamentably, not only does it mean that more people will be kidnapped, but if the Japanese were to give ISIS $200 million, that's real money where I come from. And they would undoubtedly invest it in furthering their nefarious activities.
We talked during your presentation about kind of the value of restraint as a counterterrorism policy at times. And speaking of these, hostage situations and the kind of tragic and horrible beheadings, how, from, the perspective of a country like the United States, how much more difficult does it make it for, the United States government to show restraint and practice restraint when American citizens are being taken hostage and killed by these groups, and then they're broadcasting it to the world?
No, it makes it very hard. And this is, the ISIS and Al-Qaeda folks are very smart. They understand political theater, and they understand, that making a horrible execution, widely available, puts a lot of pressure on the governments of the people involved to respond to it in some way. But remember, they want us to respond. They want us to pay the money, or they want us to overreact and commit large numbers of troops. And if that's what they want, we want to do the exact opposite. And I think, as cruel as this sounds, it's better to have 3 Americans die and ISIS get no money, and we put no American service people in harm's way, and deprive them of their political and symbolic goals.
Another question coming in from the audience here is, under what conditions does it make sense to have a light boot print similar to what you saw in the raid that killed Osama bin Laden versus the use of drones when combating terrorism and targeting certain terrorist targets?
Well, I think the bin Laden thing was in some respects unique, because there I think the assessment was that there was a lot of intelligence of value that human operators could pick up. That, you know, if we were just dropped, you know, a 2,000-pound bomb on that house, it would have achieved, you know, the same objective, but we wouldn't have been able to exploit that intelligence. I also think, you know, we've conducted a number of rescue attempts, both in Syria and in Yemen, to try to free hostages. And, you know, sometimes that works, although those are among the hardest operations to conduct of any military operation. And sometimes they fail. But you know, obviously, if you want to try to rescue a hostage, and I think if we get actionable intelligence and we think we can do it, sending operators, you know, human operators on the ground rather than drones is the best way to deal with it. And you know, I was finally, I was happy to you know, have a significant American military component on the ground in Afghanistan after the overthrow of the Taliban in November of 2001. In fact, I wish we'd have had more boots on the ground there, because we had Osama bin Laden surrounded at a place called Tora Bora in the east of Afghanistan. And if we'd sent the Ranger Regiment in rather than the, you know, the local yokels, we might have gotten him 10 years earlier. So, you know, clearly that would have been a case where I would have put a lot of boots on the ground. But in most cases, I think you're better off thinking about how you can do it with the smallest boot print possible.
Reminder to those of you watching live, we only have a few minutes left here, so if you've got more questions for Professor Desch, please submit them now. We talked a lot about how, you know, there's a strategic reason for terrorism from the perspective of, you know, the weak. And is there also, does terrorism, though, does it help, is it effective? Does it, while it might be strategically correct or seem strategically correct from their perspective, does it often meet the goals of the groups who are practicing it?
Sometimes and sometimes not. I think that, you know, for example, in the Palestinian case, that, you know, terrorism was probably ultimately counterproductive. The Israeli military was pretty effective, and the security services operating against them. And I think in the court of public opinion, you know, images of, you know, Fedayeen killing kids on school buses didn't help the cause. So I think in the Palestinian case, waging the struggle nonviolently, you know, through, you know, seeking to join the United Nations or the International Criminal Court probably made good sense. But there are other cases where terrorist campaigns, you know, had some effect. There's no doubt that the campaign of Jewish terrorism against the British in Mandate Palestine raised the costs to the British of maintaining their presence there, and, you know, led them to say, to heck with this, and to pull out. But in any case, again, you want to be very careful to say in these cases where it may, you know, have contributed to achieving the goals of the people that used it. It was invariably a small part of a larger integrated political military campaign. And, you know, there are probably no cases of people operating strictly by terrorism who got what they wanted. There's almost invariably a political fight that has to be fought and won in order to achieve the goals.
Tim put forth a question here asking, can you address the terrorists in Africa and possible remedies, perhaps speaking about the situation in Nigeria?
Yeah, well, I think there the issue for us is, can we build up the capabilities of indigenous security forces to the point where they will be effective enough to combat these groups, but not also be so effective that they're a threat to civilian government. But, you know, the United States efforts in Africa are run through our newest combatant command, AFRICOM, which is headquartered, ironically, in Stuttgart, Germany. But most of what AFRICOM does is training and mill-to-mill contacts, and I think that's appropriate. I think the other thing that we've done that's been pretty effective is we've allowed other countries, especially the French, who have longer ties with these countries, they were former French colonies, and also local expertise to do the heavy lifting when we needed military intervention. So Mali, I think, is a good example of that. It's not pretty, and it doesn't always happen as quickly as we'd like. But again, I think it's better to let other countries do it badly than for us to always do it ourselves.
When we talk about the strategies for counterterrorism and, you know, boots on the ground versus sort of more targeted and using more diplomacy and the value of restraint, it seems like in the United States right now, there doesn't seem to be among the public an overwhelming appetite for boots on the ground to fight ISIS or other threats. Is that, based on your presentation, is that, do you know why that is, and is that encouraging to you, given what you kind of presented on earlier today?
Well, 10 years of almost constant, more than 10 years of constant combat in Afghanistan, Iraq, and then Afghanistan again, with you know, over 5,000 Americans killed and you know, tens of thousands seriously wounded, such that they'll be wards of the state for the rest of their lives. And a huge price tag. Some people, the economist at Columbia, Joseph Stiglitz, estimates the total cost between $2 and $3 trillion at a time when the United States was in the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. It's hardly surprising that the public would have had a bellyful. The thing that worries me is that in March of 2003, almost 75% of the American public supported the Bush administration's decision to go into Iraq, which I regarded as a strategic blunder of the highest order and a diversion from the real fight against Al-Qaeda. And I worry that the public, in the wake of things like the Paris shootings or you know, the seeming onslaught of ISIS in Iraq, you know, could forget those lessons and be terrorized into making dumb strategic decisions. So I guess the reason I feel the need to counsel continuing restraint is that I think we could unlearn this lesson very quickly.
Unfortunately, we're all out of time. Professor Desch, thank you so much for joining us. I think we all learned a lot about this obviously very important and serious topic facing the world in the United States. So thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. And thanks to all you who joined us live and participated by submitting questions. To look at past online learning events we've had or keep up with what events are coming up in the weeks and months ahead, please visit my.nd.edu/online learning. And you can go there and watch all our full collection of not only from this show, but our other online learning programs as well. I'm Kevin Brennan with the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Thanks so much for watching.